Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshe Emet, and joining me are my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanofsky, Anshe Chesed in New York City. Great to see you. We are in the countdown to Pesach. I have a countdown clock that says it's like 14 days and 6 hours and 30 minutes, etc. And that just means, nothing, because we're not going to be able to do it. We know b'chipazon, we left in haste, and we also prepare in haste. But let's see if we can get together on this. In the meantime, the Torah serves up for us a new book, Vayikra. What a great thing. We ended last week, ended the book of Shemot, and it's a milestone in our life, but a milestone to begin a new book. But it's a puzzle, because the word that starts the book, Vayikra el Moshe, he called Moses, Vayidaber Adonai elav, and God spoke to him, Me'ol Moed, from the tent of meeting, saying. So what does that mean? And how do you understand it? Because on the face of the verse, there's no subject to the verse. Vayikra is like, someone called, he called, who called, and how did so how do we understand Vayikra? How do we understand? And maybe in asking how we understand this, I'm also asking, what's the overture of the book? Do you want to try and answer these questions? Pick a colleague. I'm going to.
All right, Jeremy, you're up.
Okay, I'll go. Well, I like an answer that I think requires a little bit of fanciful, extra creative reading. But I think, first of all, I find it very appealing, but I think it also does make sense. So if you read the chapters 39 and 40 in Exodus, which we read last Shabbat, that the construction of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the Ohel Moed, the people did exactly this amazing achievement. They did it exactly as God had prescribed it through the instructions through Moshe and the artisans of Betzalel and Oholiab. And then God, as the plan, inhabits the tabernacle, and Ukvod Adonai Malei et Mishkan, and the divine presence fills the tabernacle. V'lo yachol Moshe, but Moses cannot go in to the tabernacle because the divine presence fills up 100% of the space. It's like the luminous cloud, which is usually how the Bible seems to refer to, quote, Kavod Adonai, the glory of the Lord, not just like hooray, terrificness. It's like a luminous cloud, fills the whole space of the tabernacle. There's no room for humanity to enter. And then if you just read consecutively, even though, yes, there is a break between the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus, if you sort of read over the break, Exodus ends, and Moses can't enter. There's too much God. There's no room for humanity. And then it goes to Vayikra el Moshe. And then he calls Moses and begins to speak to Moses. I would read it as God calls Moses and begins to speak to Moses, that God, at the end of Exodus, has all the space, but at the beginning of Vayikra is God summons Moshe into the encounter and prepares to communicate.
So I would ask you two questions. This would make it, I think, the only time that the Kavod Adonai is speaking. Here is speaking to Moses. And where is Moshe? He can't be in the Ohel Moed because that's filled with God's presence and God is speaking from there. So where would you situate him?
Well, why is that exactly a problem? Because Moses could be right at the edge. And God speaks, God summons Moses to enter the Ohel Moed that had previously not been accessible. That strikes me as.
So you're saying
I'm not saying it's a problem necessarily, but it does require an explanation, such as the one that you offer.
Well, let me offer this one, which is there's a little danger here, because if the cloud is filling the tent, so you can't really breathe in there, okay? And that defines a space. The space has a real boundary, and Moses is really at the edge of the boundary because he can't go in. And so, instead of Moses going in, it's the voice is coming out, the dibur, and it's almost like saying it's a photon, it's an energy packet that is coming out, and it's going to saying to Moses, and that moment where there's a crossing over from one zone to another, that's a very powerful moment. And I think, we pick up on that. We pick up on also like how this sound of God's voice is being manifest in Moses. And go ahead, Mary.
Okay, so here I would add a few things. So first of all, I guess it's good to remind our listeners that the Ohel Moed, as it's conceived in the Torah, has three distinct parts. It has the courtyard where the main sacrificial altar is, and then it has a smaller room called the Kodesh, where the menorah, the incense altar, and the table are, and then the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So there's often confusion as to whether the Ohel Moed, when it's mentioned, whether it refers to the Kodesh and Kodeshim and Kodesh HaKodeshim, or to all three sections at once. So here it seems that God is speaking out of the Kodesh, or perhaps even the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and then we could put Moshe in the courtyard. And the courtyard is a place for all the Israelites. Only the Kohanim can go into the holy part.
Well, why wouldn't you put them like in front of the ark, in front of?
Well, so that's inside the
curtain.
Yeah, maybe. So that makes sense, except that if God is speaking from the Ohel Moed, I would think that Moses has to be someplace else. But
wait, is he outside of the Ohel Moed? Is he? I mean,
I think he's in the courtyard.
You think he's in the courtyard?
The curtain that separates the courtyard from the Kodesh HaKodeshim.
Sure, I just happen to have a picture of it here. So you're saying that Moses is outside the red area?
Yeah, right. Where you see the altar that's smoking.
Yeah.
And then there's the sink, it looks like, in front of it, and then the Kodesh.
Okay. So
Moses is, by the sink, say.
I said I have my finger over here. So I'm thinking Moses is outside of the courtyard because he's with the people. You're saying he's inside the courtyard.
So this is a good entree to Rashi's comment, which, as is often the case, complicates matters when he quotes the rabbis. So for the rabbis, I think Moses is inside, and the voice of God that speaks to him, which, as Rashi mentions elsewhere, is the voice that topples cedar trees and moves mountains, is only heard by Moshe.
Okay.
And the people who are definitely outside, either in the courtyard without Moses or outside the Ohel Moed altogether, they don't hear a thing. So Moses is alone with God.
It's almost like Moses is tuned to the frequency, and Moses has the extraordinary high definition receiver that nobody else can receive. And it's a wonderful metaphor for revelation that God emits on a certain frequency that only the exceptional of the exceptional receiver can actually process.
Which, by the way, I find that a very vivid description of insight, which is to say that it can't be that only the true Navi is able to discern something, and to everyone else it's a total black box, because that would make religion nonsense. Then you would just be following, any old fool. But I do think it's true that certain people are attuned to a reality, and when they communicate it to other people say, "Yeah, that's right, I see that too." So Moshe, this is why I like this. What Barry told us about this Rashi before we started recording, and then to illustrate now, I like this thought that Moshe is really attuned, can pick up on the frequency, and then transmit it to the people in a good, digestible, illuminating, accessible way for them. That's what a religious messenger should do.
So just to amplify the word attune, So this is how music works for a lot of us, that the great musician is able to put things in words and tones, the music itself, that is inaccessible to us as creators, but we can appreciate it as listeners. And this gives added significance to Moshe being the Levite, which is the tribe that's identified with music. So Moses is the divine musician.
Let's just put up the Rashi here for a second because it has some musical things here. And for those of you who are listening, we have a text on the screen. Those of you watching, you can follow. So Vayikra Moshe hakol holech umagia lo oznav. This is Rashi. The voice goes out and gets to his ears. It reaches his ears. V'chol Yisrael lo shomin. Right? The rest of Israel doesn't hear it. Yachol af la'afsakot hayta kriya. So one might. This is a translation that was on Sepharia. One might think that the subset hafsakot means more like divisions or pauses, right? The hayta kriya. But the text says he spoke ledibur hayta kriya v'lo lahafsakot. So which that means the speaking was called and not the pauses between between each packet of sound. Umeh hayu hafsakot mishamshot. What was the function of the pauses? Litein revach leMoshe litbonein. To give Moses a moment, such a beautiful idea. Give Moses a moment to think between each word. Ben parasha leparasha uvein inyan leinyan, from portion to portion, from idea to idea. So kal vachomer, how much more so lehediot alamed min hadiot. For how much more would an ordinary person learn from an ordinary person? The point that Rashi is making is that there's content in the spaces between the words, or the content between the spaces between the chapters. And you made reference to music. I'll make reference to music in a different way, which is that you play music and you're also playing the rest. I was fortunate to play clarinet in the band, and I had a wonderful teacher, Mr. Milne and Mr. Manley, two teachers. They said, play the rests. You got to play the rests, because if you come in too quickly, or if you wait too long, the music, it shifts the way the music is understood, and it shifts the tension that is being resolved in the music. And so what you have here is God speaking and Moses listening, and the communication is happening in the spaces between. It's lovely.
If this is true, then I just want to add one thing to what you said in the interpretation. There's a kriya for the dibur, which means that every time that God speaks, God initiates that with a listen up now, and then gives a speech. But God does not say, according to that, ein kriya lahafsakot would mean God would not say, listen up now and then rest. But there are the rests. There are the empty spaces and the divisions between, which would then, if that's the case, then I think that would refer to, there's certain parts of which God demands our attention, and there's certain parts that we have to pay attention to, even when God has not demanded our attention. God has not called to order, and Moshe has to bring the intentionality and the attention to the hafsakot, to the gaps between each item. And that to me also speaks powerfully about like revelation, for quote unquote orthodoxy, with a small orthodoxy, like the things you're supposed to believe that God wrote the book, and we want to say, oh, okay, so God gave us the Torah and we're the recipients of the Torah, and it's all God, it's all divine speech. Actually, a Rashi like this would say, there's a human component, and the human component is maybe not quite as important as the divine communication, but the human reception, with its own intentionality and its own mitbonening, its own reflection in between each item, and like, okay, what did I just hear? How do I apply this? That's like of awesome importance as well.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about oratory. I'm thinking about the art of public speaking, and of course, there is a similarity to music. It's the same world of discourse, public speaking. If you listen to Martin Luther King, "I Have a Dream," it's pure music. That the way he delivers the speech is music, and of course, the pauses are where the people can catch up. I always have, when preparing a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, I say, welcome to the Elliot Malamet School of Oratory. Because kids get up there and they go, blah, 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 they're so fast. I said, slow it down, because, in your head, it's like all the sound. It's like I have a visualization of like a whole train wreck, derailment, because all the words are kind of colliding with each other. I want to savor. I want to listen. I want the space to react to the words. You know what I mean?
What I would add to what you said, Jeremy, is that I think properly understood, at least how I understand it, is that revelation is a dialogue, not a monologue.
Yeah.
And what gives revelation meaning is the human understanding, because without it, it's gibberish.
Yeah. Yeah, this is very, very true. And we act this out in Judaism. Again, here you've got certain kinds of very expansive midrashim say, oh no, the whole oral Torah was also given at Sinai. That of course does not make any sense, because the Talmud says that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir discussed this, and we don't mean, and they disagreed and they had to argue with each other, and we don't mean that. Well, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir didn't actually say it. People have been saying it for thousands and thousands of years before them. No, that means we actually mean it. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir and Abaye and Rava, they're having these conversations and they're making their own points and they're having a conversation. And so I just think it's beautiful in Judaism that we think that there is a Torah shebichtav, like a written communication, and at whatever level of metaphor or mythic story we say that that's a divine communication. It's also Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah that the human beings bring to this conversation. And it's not Judaism without both of those.
All right, so let's take a baby step into the next verse, which is Daber al Bnei Yisrael ve'amarta aleim, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Adam ki akriv mikem korban ladonai, a human, a person, a man, Adam can mean man, woman, a person, ki akriv mikem korban ladonai, who will make a korban, a sacrifice to God, mina be'ma, mina bakar, mina tzon, from the herd, from large animals, from small animals, from sheep, takriva korbanchem. He will bring this offering. So I want to tell the story of this person. We have a tendency, we readers, or maybe me personally, we want to see ourselves in the text. So I remember, we talked about this. One strategy of reading the text is put your name in there, between every phrase. So it's V'amarta lehem Adam, Elliot, ki akriv mikem ladonai, right? And so all of a sudden I'm going to say my name in there, and the pause between the phrases, and go like, okay, so you're in that place, you're here, okay, and you're coming to this altar, and what's your story? So can you get into that person's head? Can you give me his story? What does he want to do? Why is this expression so important, and why does it take up so much of the Torah?
I think the baseline is he wants to thank or show appreciation for God. He has felt blessed, and now he wants to approach God in humility. And he brings a gift. Because when you want to show someone appreciation, you give them something.
So
I want to just add real quick on that. With which I agree with everything you said. That verse 4, and it says, "V'samach yado al rosh ha'olah," the person offering puts the hand on the top of the animal to be burned up. "V'nirtza lo lechaper alav," and it'll be acceptable for him to make expiation. So, we've joked about the fact, not joke, but reference the fact that the spiritual writer Anne Lamott says, there's thanks, pray, wow. But there's like three thanks, help, wow. There's like three. She says there's three basic kinds of prayers. There's, gratitude, thanks, panic, help, and just awestruck wonder. You say, wow. But there's also sorry. There's like also a prayer that is made in the spirit of contrition, and wants some forgiveness for, the sense of alienation or gap or whatever. And so sacrifices are also seen to be like, to use the like the very narrow technical sense of the term communion. You have this meal, perhaps it can thought of as feeding God at some ancient level, or the parts that you eat yourself, but there's like communion, the human divine meeting, and you kind of reconcile for all the ways in which you spend lots of times in your life out of sorts, not right with God. You got to get right with God.
I've had the experience of being, both in the zone of urgency where life and death were in the balance, and of course being on the other side, with people as they experience that, and they have a real terror and they want to know what they can do. And often a person will feel like it's my responsibility. I have to do something to help this person, to save this person, and often they'll say, I want to do something. Is there a prayer I can say because I want to be able to kind of reconfigure the celestial forces so that my loved one will be saved, and on and on. And I'm saying that there may be all sorts of different motivations for this person to come, but the person feels that he's got to, that person has to kind of level the open. Well, he has to communicate. He has to be received. He wants to be accepted, and has to go through an experience that includes violence, includes blood, includes fire, smoke. It includes lots of terrifying things.
I mean, the truth is that it is very difficult. Because the three of us and our colleagues and other people who've studied the Torah with some intensity and like to read, as three of us do, like to read about, like scholarly examinations of ancient religion and what did this mean, and the writings of like philosophers such as Rene Girard, who talks about this, or the fabulously named Marcel Mauss. He's Mickey's cousin. They write about what it is to give a violent gift and to be brought into a sacred space, and it's very powerful stuff. It's hard for us whose worship is like poems and words and songs, and
there's no violence. There's no violence.
For us to be able to understand. And we before we started recording, we talked about the fact. Just I'll continue on that verse. I read verse 4, now verse 5. After the person puts their hands on the animal, in hopes that it will be accepted, such that they can be forgiven. And I'm reading the translation of the JPS, and it says the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord. But I don't think that's quite correct. I mean, the simple meaning is V'shachat ben habakar means that he then slaughters the animal. And I think that, for us, being an animal slaughterer, butcher, whatever you'd say, not butcher, but the one who actually does the cut across the neck of the animal, is a technical skill that most of us don't have and couldn't have any knowledge of how to do it. But I think that ancient people knew how to do that. And it was not just that the person came to the temple and said, Kohanim, priests, please take care of this for me. I think that up until the time that at a certain point, I mean, it is in this very verse 5, V'shachat ben habakar lifnei Adonai, and the person offering the animal slaughters it before the Lord. V'hikrivu b'nei Haron haKohanim et hadam, and then the priests handle the blood. So there's a technical part that priests do, but then everybody who was worshiping in these moments of, guilt or terror or wonder or thanksgiving or whatever it is, they actually, I think, slaughter the animal themselves.
I think that they have to slaughter the animal because that's what gives meaning to the chapera love. Because why do we kill the animal? Because God should take us. And we're hoping that by giving the animal, God will spare us. So it would make no sense for the priest to slaughter the animal because the priest doesn't have a stake in it yet.
So he only gets the stake afterwards.
He gets it afterwards, right?
There's a remarkable anthropologist named Margaret Visser. she has a book called The Rites of Dinner or something, and she says something like, here, I have the quote here, somewhere at the back of our minds, carefully walled off from ordinary consideration and discourse, lies the idea of cannibalism, that human beings might become food and eaters of each other. Violence, after all, is necessary if any organism is to ingest each other. I'm saying that because of food, but here the idea that when violence is used, you think she writes about how the act of slicing and preparing food, there's violence there. There's violence here in preparing a sacrifice. And at the back of our minds is the possibility that we may have been called on to be the sacrifice. And that's why I think sacrifice is not as remote as we think it is. I don't want to be too the moment of that we're in. We talked a little bit about last week is where there's collision of forces, but in Israel, the political forces and the eruption in small acts of violence that will only generate into larger acts of violence. And that's, of course, the fear. And that this is the work of René Girard. René Girard is talking about how the sacrifice was a mechanism to channel the violent impulses in a society, especially when people had mimetic desire. They wanted to imitate the other person and attain the other person's desire. The sacrifice was a way of channeling that violence out and making peace, basically.
It's important to remember here, Elliot, that in the ancient times, medieval times, life was a lot more violent than it is for us today. Most of our violence we get vicariously on TV through movies, but daily life had a violent tenor to it. There's your music reference, by the way. The violent tenor to life in the ancient world.
Yes, the music reference. Okay.
Well, I missed the music reference. What was it?
Tenor, violent tenor.
Oh, the tenor. Oh, again, it was a violent tenor. He was so difficult to work with.
Not Placido Dominguez, who would be misnamed if he were.
Well, this is right. I want to also just add one more thing about, it is because of this material from ancient Israel and ancient Judaism that Christianity makes sense. Like speaking initially to an audience that understood that that there was a way of displacing that you might feel, as Barry said, with which I completely agree, and this is out of the Ramban, that at some level you feel you don't deserve to live, and that it's your own life that should be offered to God. And in fact, that's the only true prayer, the only true worship is, I offer my life to you, not that I would die, but I would offer myself to you. But in God's great mercy, God's agreed to take an animal instead. And that's how we displace our own guilt and perhaps displace our own violence. Oh, and by the way, there was this guy, and we call him the Lamb of God. We don't call him the Lamb of God, but some other people call him the Lamb of God. He is Isha Reach Nichoach. He is the sweet savor. And
sweet savior.
The sweet savor and the savior. And that's one of the ways in which Christianity, or ancient Christianity, must have made awful good sense to a group of Jews who understood.
And it makes sense to like over 1 billion people today who have devotion in that way. You have to understand, that they wouldn't just be believing if it didn't touch a deep part of the human soul, a human narrative. That's Christianity does. We obviously have a different narrative and have a different way of responding to these very, very deep human impulses.
I love the way that we get this. All of our readers and listeners should appreciate this. That we come to the Torah and we look at a couple of verses. We got a lot to say. And it was like one verse, or like maybe 2 verses, or 3 verses. The Parsha's got lots of verses. The Parsha has so much to say, but it's like you can't get past the first couple because they're so rich.
They're rich.
So my wife, when I had a congregation, I would often speak on the first verse or two, because I'd find something interesting, and she would tell the congregants it's because that's as far as he got to read that week.
Well, there's something to be said for that as well. No, I spent some time teaching the first verse this week to my class, and you know, I was. It's not amazing. It's so overwhelming. The number, the richness of midrashim on you know, God speaking to Moses, and Moses and his humility, and Moses as the beloved partner to God, and Moses as the exceptional, and how we imagine this moment, and what it's trying to tell about the relationship, the divine relationship here. So these are.
I have just a couple things I want to say about some more stuff in the parsha. Maybe we'll reach I don't know how much time we have left. Maybe we'll reach the very last bit in Leviticus 5, which I think is really interesting. But in this parasha, in the sacrifices that are described, we start off with the olah and the full animal, and then then we're talking about different kinds of other sacrifices. It could come from the cow or the small animal or the birds. And then, we get on to, well, what about if you offer a grain offering and different kinds of cake styles, fried or meal or whatever. And these are all, first of all, these are all discretionary. In later chapters, we'll talk about the obligatory things that have to happen every day, or the things that happen if you have a chatat for a sin, a purification offering for a sin. But these are the discretionary ones. And I think it's pretty interesting that in a religion that really does privilege the have-tos and says about the, choose-tos, oh, okay, it's good too. I think it's interesting that Vayikra starts with the choose-tos. You feel it, you desire, you have this free will offering. I think that's pretty great. And also, I think it's pretty great that the Torah goes, well, you might give an animal, but maybe you can't afford an animal. There are other vehicles by which you can express your devotion that are much less expensive. There's worship for every budget, and then there's the things that are totally burned to God, the things that are shared in human feasting, partly to God, but partly in human feasting. And I think that's pretty amazing. The system of worship is not entirely taken over by the divine. It's like, how do we invite different people in different idiosyncratic spots in their lives into some sort of worship experience? And it sounds very modern, but it's actually what happens in the first chapters of Leviticus.
So it's part of, I think, what one could say is a subtle reshaping of the meaning of sacrifice. By emphasizing the discretionary or the voluntary nature, we get away from the idea that these sacrifices are expiation for us. Rather, that it's because we want to do this, not because we're fearful of losing our life, but rather out of a sense of blessing and gratitude that we're going to approach God.
Remember when he says sacrifice in English, you immediately go to think of the thing that is lost. You sacrificed X or Y or Z. But both in English and in Hebrew, it's not quite right, because sacrifice really means to make sacred. You sacrifice, and korban means you draw close, you karov. And I think those are really, I think that's like religiously rich. These are methods by which you can bring sacredness and nearness between the human and God.
Well, there's one more layer of this that I want to kind of put out there for you, which is that there's also an element of order and chaos here. And that, thinking about the Adam, okay, Elliot, going in there, the sacrifice, right? So I'm coming from a world that may be presently in a state of chaos, right? Outside the sanctuary, things are beyond control. And we certainly see that. We certainly see that in our world. We see it in the political world. We see that in the natural world. There are lots and lots of things that are out of control. And yet, when I come in, I want to at least reach for some kind of ordering act. So the slaughter actually, and which is the moment of life and death, the procedures with the blood, and also the layering of the animal in its various pieces in a highly ordered structure, is a way of creating or recreating a new sense of order out of the chaos which is our lives. And that's one of the central dramas going on in the sanctuary.
So that was beautifully said, Elliot. And it reminds us that sacred space is ordered space.
Ordered space.
It is a defiance of chaos, and it's a way to bring order, which we associate with God, from the creation story, into the world, because so much of it, as you said, is without it.
It's amazing. Well, we have an ordering principle here, which is time. The time is the ordering principle. We reach the end of our time together. Before we conclude, first, we totally, I didn't say this at the beginning, honor our people, our audience who are watching and listening. We can't tell you how thankful we are that you spent this time with us. We're so grateful to you. And I get nachas when people tell me, and tell all of us, I used what you said in a Dvar Torah, or it made me think about this. This is the best nachas ever. And special Yasher Koach shout out, Rabbi Eitan Cantor is the new director of Camp Ramah in the Berkshires. We want to wish him well as he starts off a new post. He was in Ottawa, my hometown. Rabbi Cantor, we want to wish you well and hope that you enjoy and keep us around for Parsha Talk.
We're going to come visit.
We're coming to visit, definitely.
To the original studio.
Amen.
Yeah, that'll be great.
It's Rosh Chodesh, so Chodesh Tov, and see you all next week on the next edition of Parsha Talk. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.